He walked into a cafe like an ordinary customer, but a police officer decided to humiliate him and cracked an egg right over his head. The entire place froze because no one expected what would happen next. Watch till the end, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what you would do in his place and where you're watching from. Chuck Norris turned off the highway without any sense of arrival. The diner appeared the way places like that always did. Sudden, unannounced, standing alone beside the road as if it had grown there rather than been built. A low structure with a broad front window, a faded sign humming softly above the entrance. A parking lot marked by oil stains and the slow heat of the day. There was nothing about it that suggested importance. That was precisely why he chose it. He parked among a handful of cars and trucks, shut off the engine, and remained still for a moment, listening to the quiet ticking of metal cooling under the hood. Inside, through the glass, he could see movement. Silhouettes shifting, a server passing between tables, someone leaning back in a booth. Ordinary life. He opened the door and stepped out, the smell of asphalt and dust giving way to the faint sweetness of grease and coffee as he pushed inside. The diner greeted him with a low, steady hum. Cutlery touched plates. A bell rang softly near the kitchen. Conversations blended into a single, indistinct sound. Rows of red leather booths lined both sides of a central aisle, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. Wooden tables reflected the daylight pouring through the wide windows, and the floor bore the quiet scuffs of countless footsteps. It was clean without trying to be impressive, familiar without being memorable. Chuck paused just long enough to take it in, not staring, not searching, simply noticing. Where the light fell strongest, how the aisle narrowed near the back, where people sat and how they held themselves. He moved with the unhurried ease of someone who did not expect trouble, but never assumed its absence. He chose a booth on the left side, halfway down the room. From there, he could see most of the diner without being centered in it. He sat, resting one hand lightly on the table, his posture relaxed but deliberate. His hat remained on, brim casting a mild shadow over his eyes. When a laminated menu was set before him, he glanced at it without urgency, already aware that the decision mattered little. Around him, the diner went on with itself. A middle-aged couple spoke quietly over coffee, their heads bent toward each other as if guarding a shared secret. A truck driver sat alone near the window, staring outside between bites. Two college-age kids leaned over their phones, barely touching their food. Near the counter, a man with a laptop typed steadily, headphones in place, detached from the room. The servers moved between tables with practiced rhythm. One of them, a teenager by the look of him, carried plates with careful hands and eyes that darted just slightly too often. He was thin, shoulders a bit tense, his movements precise in a way that suggested effort rather than habit. When he set a glass down, he checked its position twice before stepping away. When he passed another server, he offered a quick nod and a restrained smile, as though reassurance itself required permission. Chuck noticed him without focusing. The boy was part of the room's quiet pattern, nothing more. Then there was the other presence. The police officer sat closer to the center of the diner, occupying a booth with an ease that bordered on ownership. His uniform was clean, his posture casual, one arm draped along the backrest. He spoke occasionally, his voice low but firm, the kind that carried without effort. When he shifted, others shifted too. Servers adjusting their paths, diners lowering their voices just enough to acknowledge him without admitting it. Chuck registered the officer the way one notices a weight added to a scale. Nothing overt, nothing immediately wrong. But the balance of the room leaned subtly around that booth, as if everyone had agreed, without discussion, to move carefully near it. The teenage server approached the officer's table, shoulders squared with quiet resolve. He set down a plate, hesitated, then adjusted it by a fraction of an inch. The officer did not look up at first. He tapped the edge of the table once, slowly, then raised his eyes. The exchange that followed was quiet. There was no raised voice, no sudden motion, but something in the air tightened. The boy stood still, hands folded loosely in front of him, head inclined just enough to listen. The officer leaned forward slightly, his smile thin, his words delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Chuck did not hear what was said. He did not need to. He watched the boy's expression shift, not dramatically, but in small, telling ways. The tightening of the jaw, the slight dip of the chin, the way his fingers curled inward, then relaxed again, as if responding to an instruction that carried weight beyond its meaning. The boy nodded once, then again, and stepped back. He turned toward the kitchen, his movements a touch less steady than before. As he passed Chuck's booth, his eyes flicked upward for an instant, then away. Not a plea, not a challenge, just a glance, brief and uncertain. The officer remained where he was, satisfied, his posture unchanged. He took a sip from his cup and leaned back, surveying the room with casual assurance. Chuck lowered his gaze to the menu, though he did not read it. The room settled again, conversation resuming at a cautious volume. Plates were carried, chairs shifted, a laugh sounded and quickly faded. On the surface, nothing had happened, yet the diner was no longer quite as quiet. The boy returned to work, moving between tables with renewed precision. He wiped a counter that was already clean, adjusted napkin holders, refilled glasses before they were empty. His shoulders stayed tense, his focus narrowed. Each time he neared the officer's booth, his steps slowed, as if he were crossing an invisible line. The officer watched him with faint amusement, saying nothing now, needing no further action to maintain control. His presence alone seemed enough. Chuck ordered his meal when another server approached, her tone polite and neutral. He thanked her and waited, his attention returning to the room not as a spectator, but as a witness. He noticed how the boy avoided the officer's gaze, how other patrons avoided both of them. He noticed the way fear did not announce itself loudly, but settled instead into routine, into habit. The food arrived. Chuck ate slowly, methodically, tasting without distraction. Grease and salt, heat and texture, normal things. All the while, the scene continued to unfold in fragments. A comment from the officer that made the boy stop mid-step. A gesture that sent him back toward the kitchen. Each interaction brief, contained, easy to overlook if one chose not to see. Chuck did not choose that. He watched, not with anger, not yet, but with clarity. He recognized the pattern. The officer was not enforcing anything. He was asserting something. Power, unchallenged, exercised quietly where it was least likely to be resisted. The boy was an easy target, young, new, afraid of consequences that stretched beyond this room. The diner, too, was an easy place, familiar, predictable, a space where people came to rest, not to confront. Chuck finished his meal and set his utensils down neatly. He wiped his hands and leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, thoughtful. The boy passed again, and this time the officer spoke just loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. The words themselves were still indistinct, but their effect was not. The boy stopped, his face flushing, his posture shrinking by degrees. Chuck looked up. His eyes met the officer's then, not sharply, not aggressively, simply directly. A calm, assessing look that did not retreat. It lingered only a moment, but it was enough. The officer noticed. For the first time since Chuck had entered, something shifted in the room. The officer's smile faltered, just briefly, before returning sharper than before. He held Chuck's gaze, measuring it, interpreting it. What he saw there did not resemble fear, nor did it resemble indifference. It resembled attention. The officer leaned back again, breaking eye contact with a small, deliberate laugh. He said something to the boy, who nodded quickly and moved away. The exchange was over, but the focus had changed. Chuck remained where he was, outwardly unchanged. Inside, the moment settled into place, precise and clear. He had not intervened. He had not acted. But the room had acknowledged something nonetheless. The quiet had been disturbed. And as the diner continued its ordinary rhythm, the space between the officer's booth and Chuck's table began to feel smaller, charged with a tension that had not existed before. What had started as a silent observation had been noticed. What had been contained was now exposed. The calm of the room held, but it was no longer effortless. It waited, balanced on something unseen, as though aware that whatever came next would not be accidental. The diner did not change all at once. It remained what it had been a minute before. Red booths, bright tables, the smell of coffee and warm bread drifting from the kitchen. People kept eating, Forks still scraped plates in small, ordinary rhythms. A spoon clinked against a mug. Somewhere near the counter, the bell above the pass-through rang softly again, and a cook's voice floated out in a tone that sounded almost cheerful. If a stranger had walked in at that moment, he might have felt nothing more than the comfort of a busy room. But Chuck Norris felt the difference the way a person feels a draft at the back of the neck. Subtle, undeniable, a quiet warning. He sat where he was, hands relaxed on the table, his expression still and unreadable. The last exchange had ended, yet it had left behind a thin tension, like a thread stretched too tight. He could see it in the boy's shoulders as he moved away. He could see it in the way the waitress who had taken Chuck's order slowed near the officer's booth, hesitated, and chose a longer path around it, as if the direct line were suddenly blocked. The officer remained seated, and that was part of what made it worse. A man who shouts broadcasts his need. This man did not need to shout. He did not need to rise. He owned the space as he sat, calm and solid, and the room made room for him without being asked. He held his cup with an absent ease and watched the teenager return to his duties with the same faint amusement a person might show toward a dog being trained. The boy moved quickly toward the kitchen, but not with confidence, more like someone hurrying past a door that might open at any moment. He disappeared behind the swinging half door and came out again with a small tray, balanced carefully in one hand. 2 plates, a bowl, a stack of napkins. He walked toward a table by the window and set the items down with precise care, pausing to align the napkin stack so it sat square. His fingers were steady, but the movement was too controlled, as if he were concentrating on the napkins to avoid thinking about something else. Chuck watched him without appearing to. His eyes drifted only slightly, and his face remained calm. The boy turned and headed back down the aisle, cutting between booths the way the staff had learned to do, sliding through narrow spaces without bumping shoulders, without forcing diners to shift their knees. In an ordinary moment, it would have been just work. Here it looked like navigation through hazards. As he passed the officer's booth again, the officer spoke, low enough that most diners could keep pretending not to hear. The sound was not loud, but it drew attention the way a knife drawn quietly draws a room's focus. The boy stopped at once, as if the words had a physical weight. He turned back, his posture tightening. The officer leaned forward a fraction. His expression remained almost friendly, his mouth curving as though he were sharing a joke. The boy listened, eyes lowered briefly, then lifted with forced attentiveness. He nodded once, too quickly, and the officer's smile sharpened, satisfied. It was not the content of the exchange that mattered. It was the structure, command, compliance, control. The boy moved again, this time toward the kitchen. He pushed through the swinging door with a little too much force, as if he needed the barrier between himself and the officer. The door bounced back and forth once, twice, then settled. At the nearest tables, people kept their focus on their meals with a discipline that did not feel natural. A man stirred his coffee for far too long. A woman pulled her sweater sleeves down over her hands and stared at the menu as if she had never seen one before. The truck driver by the window reached for his salt shaker, then stopped with his hand hovering above it, seemingly forgetting why he'd moved. No one said anything. That silence was not neutrality. It was participation. It was the air a bully breathes. Chuck's food arrived. The waitress set the plate down carefully and offered a polite question about anything else he might need. Her eyes met his for a brief instant, then slid away. It was not fear of him. It was fear of being seen looking at the wrong thing. Chuck nodded, thanked her, and began to eat with the same calm he had shown when he entered. He did not rush. He did not linger. His movements remained measured, as if the pace of his hands could keep the room from tipping into something worse. The teenager emerged again, now carrying a tall glass of iced tea in one hand and a plate in the other. His mouth was set in a line that suggested he was holding something in. He approached the officer's booth, placed the glass down, then slid the plate forward. The officer did not touch it. He looked at it, then looked at the boy and said something else, still quiet, still controlled. The boy's face changed in small increments. A flush rose from his neck toward his cheeks, not with anger but with humiliation. He reached for the plate again, lifted it, and turned away without protest. The officer's gaze followed him, amused. The boy moved toward the kitchen, shoulders drawn in, and the humiliation seemed to follow like a shadow. In the kitchen doorway, the boy paused. For a second, he looked back toward the officer's booth, then quickly away. The movement was involuntary, like checking a rearview mirror after a near miss. He disappeared inside. Chuck cut his food slowly and chewed without hurry. He watched the pattern take shape, and in that pattern, he recognized something he had seen in places far from diners. An authority that fed on small concessions, a power that did not need to strike hard because it struck often. The officer was not assaulting anyone. He was cultivating a climate, and climates shape people more effectively than blows. After a moment, the boy returned. This time he carried the same plate, but the arrangement of food had been altered. Something removed, something replaced. He placed it down again with careful precision. His hands were steady, yet a faint tremor remained in his fingers. The officer inspected the plate like a man inspecting a tool, then nodded slowly as if granting approval. The boy exhaled silently and stepped back. Still, it wasn't over. The officer's eyes lingered on the boy's apron, on the name tag pinned to it. He said another sentence, and the boy's shoulders rose and fell quickly, as though he were swallowing. He nodded again and turned away. The boy hurried to another table, refilling water glasses that were already half full. He wiped an invisible spot on the counter. He carried out a basket of fries with exaggerated care. Each action looked less like work and more like a performance designed to prove he was doing enough, doing it right, doing it without giving any reason for attention. Chuck understood the boy's fear. It wasn't only the officer, it was what the officer represented. Paperwork, accusations, a call to a manager, a complaint that could follow a kid home. It was the story of a teenage employee being disrespectful to a cop, a story that would always be believed by default. The boy was not choosing silence because he lacked pride. He was choosing survival. What made it worse was the way the room accepted that survival strategy as the only one available. A woman at a nearby table glanced toward the officer and the boy, and then quickly turned back to her companion, lowering her voice as if the officer could hear the direction of her thoughts. The man with the laptop typed steadily, refusing to look up, but his shoulders were stiff and his jaw clenched. The students behind Chuck's booth pretended to laugh at something on a phone, but their laughter came out thin, brittle. The officer seemed to sense the quiet accommodation, and it fed him. He leaned back and stretched one arm along the booth, taking up space. He was in no hurry. His power did not require urgency. The teenager crossed the aisle again, carrying a small metal tray with a few bills on it. He passed the officer's booth, eyes fixed on the floor just ahead of his shoes. It was the safest place to look. But safety is never perfect. The officer's voice cut across the aisle again. Not loud, just sharp enough. The boy stopped mid-step. The tray tipped slightly and one bill slid a fraction of an inch. The boy corrected it instantly, hands moving with a quickness that betrayed his nerves. He turned toward the officer, and for a moment his face was open, caught between youth and responsibility, between humiliation and restraint. The officer leaned forward, elbows on the table. His expression was patient, like a teacher correcting a student. He said something, and the boy's eyes widened. He shook his head quickly, then seemed to catch himself and froze, as if even the movement of refusal might be punished. He tried again, smaller this time. A half shake, a nervous swallow. The officer's smile disappeared entirely. Chuck watched that change closely. The officer's control did not depend on volume. It depended on the certainty that his disappointment would bring consequences. The boy knew that certainty too. A manager, an older man with tired eyes, appeared from behind the counter and glanced toward the aisle. His eyes landed on the officer, then on the boy. For a moment, the manager's expression tightened, and Chuck saw something like resignation there. The manager did not step forward. He did not intervene. He simply turned back toward the register as if he'd seen nothing at all. That small refusal was louder than a shout. The boy nodded again, though his face looked pale now, and moved toward the kitchen. His steps were quicker, uneven. He pushed through the swinging door and vanished. Chuck took a sip of water, his gaze resting on the wood grain of the table for a moment as he considered what he was seeing. It wasn't one incident, it was a routine. Not a routine that the diner wanted, but one it had accepted. The officer came here often. That was clear from the way the staff moved around him. They knew his patterns. They knew when to approach and when to avoid. They knew the cost of drawing attention. The boy returned a minute later, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. He approached the officer's booth and set it down. The officer looked at it and then, still not raising his voice, said something that made the boy stiffen. The boy reached for the cup again, lifted it, and carried it back toward the counter, his face burning. A few diners watched now, no longer able to pretend. Their eyes followed the boy, then dropped when the officer's gaze swept the room. The officer's pleasure was not in coffee or food. It was in the smooth mechanics of obedience. Chuck's plate was half finished, but he found himself tasting less and observing more. He watched how the boy's movements became smaller, more careful, more preoccupied. He watched how the boy began to make mistakes only because he was trying too hard not to make them. He watched how the officer used those mistakes as fuel. When the boy returned with a corrected cup of coffee, his hand was steadier. He had forced it to be. The officer accepted the cup without thanks. He held it for a moment and then, as if testing something, tilted it slightly, letting a few drops spill onto the table. The boy's eyes snapped down to the spill. He grabbed a napkin at once, wiping it quickly, too quickly, as if speed could erase the insult. The officer watched with a mild smile and said something that made the boy nod again. Chuck felt the quiet anger rise in him, not explosive, not reckless, but heavy and controlled. He recognized it as the same anger that comes when a rule has been broken, not a written rule, but a human one. The boy was not being corrected. He was being diminished. The officer leaned back again, satisfied with the small spill and the immediate response. The boy stepped away and nearly collided with the waitress carrying a tray. She recovered at the last second, balancing the plates with a practiced skill. Her eyes flashed to the officer's booth, then to the boy. Her mouth tightened. She did not speak. She moved on. The boy paused behind Chuck's booth, perhaps to collect himself, perhaps to count his breaths. For an instant, his hands rested on the back of the booth. Chuck could feel in the way the boy stood there that he was trying to become invisible. Then the boy moved again, returning to his circuit of tasks. The officer's gaze drifted, and for a moment it landed on Chuck. Not directly, not confrontationally, but like a finger tapping a surface to test its hardness. Chuck met that gaze without changing his expression. Calm, steady, present. The officer's mouth curved slightly, and he looked away again. He had noticed Chuck's attention earlier, and now he seemed to weigh it, as if deciding whether it mattered. The boy approached the officer once more, this time with a small plate, perhaps a side dish or a refill, something routine. As he reached the booth, his foot caught lightly on the edge of the aisle runner. The plate tilted. A smear of sauce slid toward the rim. The boy corrected it instantly, but one drop fell onto the table. The room seemed to inhale. The officer looked down at the drop of sauce as if it were evidence in a case. He looked up at the boy and the quiet amusement on his face faded into something colder. He spoke, still low, but the tone sharpened. The boy froze. His cheeks flushed, then drained. He reached for a napkin again, wiping the table in quick, frantic strokes, too hard as though he were scrubbing guilt itself. The officer lifted a hand, not touching the boy, but holding him in place with a gesture. He said another sentence. The boy's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, toward the manager, toward the other waitress, anywhere for help. No one moved. The manager pretended to organize receipts. The waitress pretended to check a table number. The patrons pretended to focus on their plates. The boy looked back at the officer and nodded, his lips pressed together so tightly they went white. Chuck watched that moment carefully. It was the same moment he had seen in other contexts, when a person realizes no one is coming, and that realization changes something inside. The boy did not cry. He did not shout. He accepted what he thought was inevitable. That acceptance was the real injury. The officer leaned back and lifted his cup, taking a slow sip, as if the drop of sauce had been a minor inconvenience. But Chuck could see the satisfaction in the officer's eyes. He had reminded the boy and the room of the hierarchy. He had reminded them without a scene, without a report, without any risk to himself. Chuck set his fork down. He did not stand. He did not intervene. Not yet. He understood something that the diners around him did not. If he stepped in too early, he would become the story, and the officer would become the victim, and the boy would remain trapped. The officer's strength lay in twisting situations into narratives that protected him. Chuck remained quiet, and in that quiet he gathered the necessary details. The officer's posture, the boy's responses, the manager's avoidance, the waitress's restrained alarm, the diner's silence, the positions in the room, the invisible lines of fear. The boy moved away, and for the first time since Chuck had entered, he seemed to stumble, not physically but emotionally, his composure fraying. He paused by the counter, his back turned to the room, shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. He inhaled, exhaled, and forced his hands to stop shaking. Then he turned and returned to the floor. As he passed Chuck's booth, his eyes flicked to Chuck's face for a fraction of a second. That glance carried no plea, no accusation, no request for rescue. It carried something smaller and sadder. Surprise that someone was still looking. Chuck held the boy's gaze briefly, just long enough for the boy to know he had been seen. Then the boy looked away again and kept walking. The officer watched the exchange from his booth. He saw the glance. He saw the connection. His eyes narrowed slightly, and the faint smile returned. But now it held an edge. His attention, which had been so comfortably fixed on the boy, began to drift toward Chuck again, pulled by irritation like a magnet. The diner continued to hum and clatter. Plates moved, coffee poured, the bell rang in the kitchen. Everything ordinary persisted. Yet the pressure in the room had changed shape. It was no longer only the officer and the teenager. A third element had entered the equation, the steady, unflinching presence of someone who did not look away. Chuck finished his meal and wiped his hands. He did not leave. He sat for a moment longer, letting the room settle around him, his expression still calm. Across the aisle, the officer shifted in his seat, angling his body slightly as if to get a better view. What had started as quiet observation had become something the officer could not ignore. And in that slow, unnatural calm, Chuck could feel the next stage approaching, as certain as weather. The officer would not tolerate being watched. Not by a boy who couldn't fight back, and especially not by a man who refused to show fear. The pressure that had been applied without noise was beginning to search for a new outlet. The diner remained bright and ordinary, full of red booths and daylight. But beneath that ordinary surface, the room was preparing to choose a side. The moment did not announce itself. There was no sharp sound, no sudden movement that marked a clear beginning. It arrived the way realization often does, quietly, with a shift so slight that it might have been missed if not for the tension already coiled in the room. The officer had grown accustomed to the boy's compliance, to the way the diner bent around him without protest. What unsettled him now was not defiance, but the absence of it from a different direction. Chuck Norris remained seated, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. He had finished eating, yet he had not reached for his wallet or signaled to leave. He stayed, not as a challenge but as a constant. His gaze moved through the diner with a calm deliberation, registering motion and reaction without fixating. When his eyes returned to the officer, they did not flick away. They did not harden. They simply stayed. The officer felt it before he fully understood it. A pressure not unlike the one he had been applying to the boy, but inverted. He glanced up from his coffee and caught Chuck's eyes on him, not staring, not narrowing, not performing any visible act of judgment, just observing, the kind of look that asked nothing and yet demanded an answer. For a fraction of a second, the officer's expression faltered. The smile that had come so easily before thinned, then reasserted itself with more effort. He held Chuck's gaze, assessing it the way he might assess a suspect during an interview, searching for tells, for nerves, for the usual markers of submission. He found none. There was no tension in Chuck's face, no eagerness, no challenge. Only attention. That, more than anything else, unsettled him. The officer leaned back, breaking eye contact with a soft laugh that sounded casual enough to pass for ease. He turned his head slightly, addressing the boy again, with a remark meant to reassert the original order of things. The boy, who had just returned from the kitchen with a cloth in hand, stiffened and hurried over, his eyes flicking toward the officer's booth before dropping again. The officer spoke quietly, and the boy nodded. The exchange was brief, but it served its purpose. The officer needed to remind himself and the room that his authority still functioned. The boy moved away, shoulders tight, and disappeared toward the counter to tend to another task. Chuck watched the officer's attention follow the boy for a moment, then drift back, as if pulled by an irritation that had not been resolved. Chuck did not lower his eyes. He did not tilt his head. He remained still, his presence offering no reaction for the officer to seize upon. The officer's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, impatient motion. He had dealt with fear his entire career. He knew how it smelled, how it moved. He knew how to provoke it, how to exploit it, how to use it as leverage. What sat across the aisle from him now did not smell of fear. It did not smell of anything at all. The officer stood. The movement was unhurried, almost lazy. He slid out of the booth with the ease of someone who did not expect resistance, straightened his uniform, and stepped into the central aisle. Conversations faltered around him, not stopping outright but lowering in volume, as if the room itself were trying not to draw attention. The waitress at the far end of the diner slowed, adjusting her grip on the tray she carried. The man with the laptop finally looked up, his fingers pausing above the keys. The officer took a few steps down the aisle, stopping near Chuck's booth but not directly in front of it. He angled his body slightly, presenting a casual profile, as though he were simply stretching his legs. His presence filled the narrow space between tables, forcing nearby diners to shift their knees inward. He glanced around, acknowledging the room with a look that invited no challenge. Chuck remained seated, his shoulders relaxed, his hands resting loosely on the table. He felt the shift in proximity, the calculated intrusion into his personal space. He did not move to make room. He did not lean away. He simply looked up, his gaze level. The officer smiled down at him, a smile practiced enough to look friendly while carrying a hint of threat. He said something in a tone that suggested a joke, something that might have earned a nervous laugh from someone else. Chuck did not respond. He did not smile. He did not frown. He did not answer at all. Silence settled between them, heavier than any spoken word. The officer's smile tightened. He had expected something: confusion, annoyance, embarrassment. Silence was not on his list. Silence did not give him leverage. Silence gave the room time to watch. The officer shifted his weight and glanced briefly toward the boy who was now at the counter, pretending to reorganize a stack of receipts. The boy felt the look and stiffened, his hands slowing as though he were wading through thick water. The officer's attention returned to Chuck. He said something else, this time a little more pointed, the humor in it sharpened into an edge. Chuck listened without reacting. He did not look away. He did not rise. He allowed the words to pass as though they were sound without meaning. The officer leaned closer, lowering his voice. This was his preferred range, the space where authority became personal. From here, he could loom without shouting, intimidate without witnesses claiming they had heard anything. He spoke again, and this time the words carried an unmistakable note of provocation. Chuck's eyes did not change, but something in their stillness made the officer hesitate, if only for a heartbeat. He straightened again, annoyance flickering across his face before being smoothed away. He laughed lightly, as if amused by his own remark, and took a step back. Around them, the diner held its breath. The truck driver by the window had turned fully now, his meal forgotten. The couple at the nearby booth sat rigid, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. The waitress stood still, tray balanced against her hip, eyes darting between the officer and Chuck. The officer had not yet achieved what he wanted. He could feel it. The room had not aligned itself behind him in the way it usually did. The boy was still afraid, yes, but fear alone was not enough. He needed a display, something undeniable, something that would reassert the hierarchy not just for the boy, but for this quiet man who refused to look away. The officer turned back toward his booth, retrieved his coffee, and took a long sip. He looked thoughtful, as though considering his next move. Then he set the cup down and glanced toward the kitchen, his eyes lingering on the swinging door. The boy emerged a moment later, carrying a small basket of rolls wrapped in a cloth. As the boy approached another table, the officer spoke again, calling him over with a gesture that was almost lazy. The boy changed course at once, his steps quickening as he neared the officer's booth. He set the basket down and waited, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The officer did not address the rolls. He addressed the boy, his tone deceptively calm. The boy nodded, murmured something inaudible, and reached to adjust the basket. The officer shook his head slowly, as if disappointed. He pointed toward the counter, then toward the kitchen. The boy nodded again and picked up the basket, his face pale. As the boy turned away, the officer glanced at Chuck, his eyes sharp now, measuring. He was using the boy as a lever, testing whether Chuck would react. Chuck did not. He watched, attentive, but unmoving. The officer's jaw tightened. He had expected this man to intervene by now, to say something, to make a scene, to give the officer a pretext. The absence of that pretext frustrated him more than outright defiance would have. He needed to force the issue. The boy returned with the basket, now arranged differently, the cloth folded more neatly. He placed it down again and waited. The officer inspected it with exaggerated care, then nodded once. The boy exhaled quietly, relief flickering across his face. It did not last. The officer reached out and deliberately nudged the basket, tipping it just enough that one of the rolls rolled onto the table. He looked at the boy, his expression unreadable, and said something quietly. The boy froze, then reached for the roll, his hands shaking as he placed it back. The officer shook his head again, this time more sharply. He said another sentence, and the boy's eyes widened. He looked around, desperate for help, and found none. The manager was nowhere to be seen. The waitress had turned away, busying herself with a table that did not need attention. The diners watched, their faces a mixture of discomfort and resignation. Chuck watched the boy's face closely. He saw the moment when the boy's composure cracked, not into tears or anger, but into a deeper kind of hurt, the kind that teaches a person their place in the world. The officer leaned back, satisfied. He had achieved his goal with the boy, but the larger one remained. He stood again, stepping into the aisle with more purpose this time. His movements were slower, deliberate, designed to draw eyes. He stopped directly in front of Chuck's booth, close enough that Chuck could smell the coffee on his breath. The officer rested one hand on the edge of Chuck's table, fingers splayed. It was a territorial gesture, a reminder of physical presence. He looked down at Chuck and spoke in a tone that was no longer joking. Chuck met his gaze, unflinching. The officer felt a flicker of anger now, sharp and unexpected. He straightened, withdrawing his hand from the table, and laughed again, louder this time. The laugh carried, turning heads. It was the sound of a man reclaiming attention. He said something that drew a few nervous chuckles from the far end of the diner, more out of reflex than amusement. Then he turned his head slightly, addressing the room as much as Chuck. He gestured vaguely, as if including everyone in the conversation. Chuck did not respond. He did not need to. His silence had already become a statement. The officer's eyes narrowed. He had tried subtlety. He had tried proximity. Neither had produced the desired result. The calm man across from him remained unchanged, and that steadiness felt like a challenge he could not ignore. The officer took a step back, scanning the diner. His gaze landed on the counter, where a small bowl of eggs sat waiting to be used in the kitchen. He lingered there for just a moment, then returned his attention to Chuck. A smile crept across his face, slower this time, more deliberate. The boy stood near the counter, watching from the corner of his eye, a knot of dread forming in his chest. He sensed the shift, the way the officer's focus sharpened. He understood on some instinctive level that what was coming would be worse, and that it would not be about him anymore. Chuck felt the shift as well. He recognized it as the moment when intimidation gives way to spectacle. The officer was no longer content with quiet control. He wanted something visible, something that would erase the discomfort Chuck's attention had caused him. The room seemed to tighten around that realization. The diners leaned back slightly in their booths, as if trying to create distance without moving. The waitress paused mid-step, her tray balanced precariously, her eyes fixed on the officer's smile. The officer turned toward the counter, then back toward Chuck, his smile widening. He had made his decision. The look had been noticed. The pressure that had been applied without noise was about to find a louder outlet. The officer did not act immediately. That restraint was deliberate. He had learned long ago that the most effective displays of authority were not rushed. They required space, witnesses, and the slow build of anticipation. He turned away from Chuck's booth and walked back toward the center of the diner, his steps unhurried, boots striking the floor with a soft, confident rhythm that carried through the room. Conversations thinned further, tapering off into murmurs. The ordinary sounds of the diner, clinking cutlery, the hiss from the kitchen, the hum of refrigeration, felt suddenly louder, as if they were trying to fill the silence left by people who no longer knew what to say. Chuck remained seated. He felt the shift not as tension in his body, but as a change in the room's temperature, subtle yet unmistakable. The officer's decision had been made, and now it was being staged. Chuck understood the pattern well enough to know that whatever came next was meant to be seen. The officer was no longer interested in quiet dominance. He wanted affirmation. The officer stopped near his booth and rested one hand on the back of it, claiming the space again. He glanced around, making brief eye contact with several patrons, as if taking inventory of his audience. Some looked away at once. Others held his gaze for a second too long, then dropped it, their expressions fixed into careful neutrality. No one challenged him. That too was part of the performance. The teenage server stood near the counter, his hands busy with nothing in particular. He wiped the same section of counter again, then again, though it was already clean. His shoulders were tight, and his eyes flicked toward the officer despite his efforts to avoid looking. He sensed that the attention had shifted away from him, but that did not bring relief. It brought fear of a different kind. When power moved, it rarely moved gently. The officer spoke, raising his voice just enough for the first time that it carried beyond his booth. It was not a shout. It did not need to be. The tone was conversational, almost light, the way someone might speak when telling a story. Heads turned despite themselves. The waitress paused near the end of the aisle, her tray balanced against her hip, her face carefully composed. The manager hovered near the register, pretending to focus on paperwork while keeping the officer in his peripheral vision. The officer gestured toward Chuck's booth with a casual sweep of his hand, as if introducing him. He said something that drew a few uneasy smiles from the far end of the diner. The humor, if it could be called that, landed unevenly. Some people laughed because they thought they were supposed to. Others did not laugh at all. Chuck looked up, meeting the officer's gaze without haste. He did not respond. He did not need to. The officer's words were not an invitation to conversation. They were bait. The officer took a step closer, closing the distance again. This time he did not lean in quietly. He positioned himself squarely in the aisle, blocking it completely. Diners on both sides shifted in their seats, drawing their legs inward to avoid contact. The aisle became a stage, and the officer stood at its center. He spoke again, his voice still calm, but firmer now, laced with the assurance that comes from knowing one will not be contradicted. He asked a question, rhetorical in nature, and glanced around as if inviting agreement. A man near the window nodded reflexively. A woman at the counter gave a short, nervous laugh. The officer's mouth curved in satisfaction. The teenage server took an involuntary step backward. He felt the room turning, felt the focus settle fully on the interaction unfolding in the aisle. The officer was no longer simply asserting himself. He was reminding everyone present of the consequences of standing out. Chuck shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his posture not to retreat, but to settle more firmly. His movements were economical, controlled. He was not bracing himself. He was grounding himself. The officer noticed. His eyes narrowed for just a moment before he smoothed his expression again. He placed one hand on the edge of Chuck's table, fingers spread wide, claiming it as he had claimed the booth earlier. The gesture was familiar, practiced. It was meant to remind Chuck that this was not neutral territory. The officer said something else, this time closer, his voice lowered just enough to feel intimate. Chuck could hear him clearly. He listened without reacting, allowing the words to pass over him. He did not rise to them. He did not shrink from them. He let the silence afterward stretch. That silence unsettled the officer more than any retort would have. He withdrew his hand from the table and straightened, irritation flashing briefly across his face. He laughed again, louder, sharper, as if to drown out the discomfort he felt. He turned away from Chuck and addressed the room again, his tone shifting into one of mock explanation. He spoke about respect, about knowing one's place, about how easy it was for people to forget the rules when they thought no one was watching. His words were vague enough to sound reasonable, but his eyes kept returning to Chuck, measuring whether the message was landing. The diners listened, their faces a mix of agreement, discomfort, and quiet resentment. They understood, even if they could not articulate it, that this was not really about rules. It was about hierarchy, about reminding them who could speak and who could not. The officer's gaze drifted toward the counter, where the small bowl of eggs sat waiting for the kitchen. He paused there deliberately, letting the room follow his eyes. The teenage server noticed the glance and felt a chill run through him. He understood on some instinctive level that whatever was coming would be designed to hurt without breaking any obvious laws. The officer turned back toward Chuck, his smile slow and deliberate now. He took a step toward the counter, then another, and reached for the bowl. The movement was unhurried, almost casual, as though he were simply helping himself. The waitress's eyes widened slightly. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, stopping herself from speaking. The manager shifted his weight but did not move. The officer lifted one of the eggs from the bowl, holding it loosely between his fingers. He examined it briefly, rolling it in his palm as if testing its weight. A few diners inhaled sharply. Someone whispered something under their breath, quickly silenced by a companion's hand on their arm. Chuck watched the egg without changing his expression. He felt the moment settle into place, heavy and inevitable. The officer was making his choice publicly now. This was no longer quiet pressure. This was spectacle. The officer walked back into the aisle, egg in hand. He held it up briefly, letting the room see it. A simple object, ordinary, harmless on its own. In his grasp, it became something else. A symbol. He stopped it directly in front of Chuck's booth. The teenage server stood frozen near the counter, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure others could hear it. He understood that this was being done not just to Chuck, but to everyone who had watched in silence. It was a lesson. The officer spoke again, his voice carrying easily now. He said something that made a few people laugh nervously, then something else that drew no laughter at all. He leaned closer, invading Chuck's space one final time, and raised his hand. For a moment, nothing happened. The egg hovered inches above Chuck's head. The room held its breath. Even the kitchen seemed to quiet, as if sensing the significance of the pause. Chuck did not move. He did not flinch. He did not close his eyes. He looked straight ahead, his gaze steady, his breathing even. The officer hesitated for the briefest instant, perhaps surprised by the absence of fear. Then he acted. The shell cracked sharply against Chuck's head, the sound abrupt and humiliatingly loud in the quiet room. The egg broke open, warm yolk and translucent white spilling downward, seeping through Chuck's hair and onto his collar. A few drops splattered onto the table. The smell of raw egg cut through the diner's usual scents. The officer laughed, a short, satisfied sound. He withdrew his hand and let the shell fragments fall onto the table. His laughter echoed, brittle and triumphant. This was the moment he had wanted. The room could no longer pretend nothing was happening. The teenage server's face drained of color. He stared at Chuck, horror and guilt twisting in his chest. The waitress stood rigid, her tray forgotten. Several diners stared openly now, shock etched into their expressions. One woman brought a hand to her mouth. The truck driver clenched his jaw, his fist tightening on the edge of the table. Chuck remained still. Egg yolk dripped slowly down his temple, trailing along his cheek before falling onto his shirt. The room waited, suspended between what had been done and what might follow. The officer's laughter faded into a smug smile as he stepped back, clearly pleased with himself. In his mind, the demonstration was complete. He had shown them all what happened when someone refused to look away. He had turned attention into humiliation, authority into theater. What he did not see, or chose not to, was the change taking place beneath the surface. Chuck's stillness was not surrender. It was calculation. The moment had arrived, the clear, undeniable crossing of the line he had been waiting for. Silence now would mean consent. Inaction would mean the lesson the officer intended would stand unchallenged. The egg continued to drip, each drop marking time. And in that heavy, stunned quiet, the balance of the room shifted once more, preparing for a reversal the officer could not yet imagine. For a heartbeat after the egg shattered, the diner seemed to lose its sense of time. Sound did not vanish, but it dulled, as if the room itself had flinched. The faint hiss from the kitchen, the distant clatter of a plate being set down too hard, the low hum of refrigeration, All of it receded into the background. What remained was the sight of a man sitting still with raw egg slowly sliding down the side of his face, and the understanding, shared by everyone present, that something irreversible had just occurred. Chuck Norris did not move. He did not reach up to wipe his face. He did not blink away the yolk that crept toward his eye. He sat as he had before, shoulders square, back straight, hands resting on the table. The stillness was not passive. It was deliberate, contained, and heavy with intent. The egg dripped from his hairline to his collar, soaking into the fabric of his shirt, leaving yellow stains that felt almost obscene in their visibility. The officer stood a step back now, his laughter fading into a smug grin. He watched the egg fall as if it were proof of something, proof that his authority still worked, proof that no amount of quiet observation could stand against public humiliation. He glanced around the diner, gauging reactions, savoring the shock on the faces around him. This was what he wanted: witnesses, silence enforced by embarrassment rather than fear alone. A woman near the counter covered her mouth with both hands, eyes wide. The truck driver by the window pushed his chair back an inch, then stopped, unsure whether to rise or stay seated. The couple who had been whispering earlier now sat rigid, their hands frozen mid-motion above their plates. Even the man with the laptop stared openly, his screen forgotten, his fingers no longer pretending to type. The teenage server stood near the counter, completely still. His breath came shallow and fast, his chest rising and falling too quickly. He felt a crushing sense of guilt, irrational but overwhelming, as if this moment were somehow his fault. The humiliation had started with him, after all. The officer had made sure everyone understood that. This was what happened when people failed to know their place. The waitress, still holding her tray, shifted her weight unconsciously, as though bracing herself against an unseen impact. Her face showed no hysteria, no dramatic reaction, only a restrained human shock. She had seen rude customers before. She had seen raised voices, slammed plates, threats. This was different. This was calculated. The officer spoke again, his voice relaxed, carrying easily across the room. The words themselves mattered less than the tone. Satisfied, amused, confident. He said something that framed the humiliation as a joke, something that invited the room to share in it. A couple of people let out nervous chuckles, the kind born of discomfort rather than humor. Most said nothing. Chuck remained silent. Inside him, the moment sharpened into clarity. There was no confusion now, no ambiguity about intent. The officer had crossed from intimidation into assault, from pressure into spectacle. This was no longer about misused authority in the abstract. It was about a man asserting dominance by stripping another man of dignity in front of witnesses. Chuck had waited for this line, not out of patience, but out of necessity. Before this moment, any response could have been twisted, reframed, dismissed as overreaction. Now there was no question. What had been done could not be explained away. The act was visible, undeniable, and witnessed by dozens of eyes. The officer watched Chuck closely now, expecting something. Anger, a sharp word, a sudden movement. He expected the release that always followed humiliation, the moment when the victim lashed out and proved the officer right. He wanted that. It would justify everything. Instead, Chuck did nothing. The stillness stretched, growing uncomfortable even for the officer. The grin on his face faltered, then returned. More force this time. He said something else, louder now, as if trying to provoke a reaction through volume, if not through insult. His words echoed briefly, then fell flat. Egg yolk reached the edge of Chuck's jaw and dropped onto the table with a soft, wet sound. The officer glanced down at the table, then back at Chuck's face, irritation flickering behind his eyes. The reaction he wanted was not coming fast enough. The teenage server felt tears sting his eyes, though none fell. He stared at Chuck, half expecting him to explode, half dreading that he would not. The silence was unbearable. It felt like standing at the edge of something vast and dark, waiting to see who would fall. Chuck finally moved. It was not sudden. He did not leap to his feet or strike out in rage. He reached for a napkin and wiped his face slowly, deliberately, clearing his eye, his cheek, his mouth. The movement was calm, almost ceremonial, and it drew every gaze in the room. He set the soiled napkin down, folded neatly beside his plate. Then he placed both hands flat on the table and leaned forward just enough to shift his center of gravity. The officer noticed the change immediately. Something in his posture tightened. He straightened slightly, his confidence wavering as instinct whispered that the balance was shifting. He opened his mouth to speak again, to reassert control, but the words caught somewhere between thought and breath. Chuck stood. The movement was smooth, economical. He rose to his full height without haste, pushing the bench back just enough to clear space. He did not glare. He did not clench his fists. He simply stood, facing the officer, egg still staining his shirt, his expression calm and unreadable. The room reacted as one. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as people leaned back or shifted away. Someone near the counter exhaled sharply. The waitress took an unconscious step backward, her tray dipping slightly before she steadied it again. The officer took an involuntary step back himself, then caught it and planted his feet, irritation flashing into anger. He laughed again, louder than before, trying to mask the sudden unease. He said something sharp, something meant to cut, to reassert dominance through words if nothing else. Chuck did not answer. He took one measured step forward. That was enough. The officer's laughter stopped abruptly. His body tensed, his instincts finally catching up with the situation. He raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in preparation. Half a warning, half a threat. He opened his mouth again, perhaps to invoke the law, perhaps to shout for attention. Chuck moved. The action was swift, controlled, and decisive. There was no wild swing, no dramatic wind-up. Chuck closed the distance in a single step, catching the officer off balance before he could react. His hand seized the officer's wrist, twisting just enough to disrupt his stance, while his other arm drove forward, not to strike, but to control. The officer's momentum betrayed him. His weight shifted the wrong way, his footing compromised. Gasps rippled through the diner. The officer tried to pull free, his training kicking in too late. Chuck redirected the motion, guiding rather than forcing, using the officer's own resistance against him. In seconds, the officer was bent forward, his arm locked, his balance gone. He staggered, nearly colliding with a table, before Chuck adjusted his grip and steered him clear, careful not to involve anyone else. The movement was efficient, almost clinical. Chuck was not lashing out. He was neutralizing. The officer cursed, struggling now, his composure gone. He reached instinctively toward his belt, but Chuck shifted position, cutting off the motion before it could become dangerous. A controlled pressure at the right angle forced the officer's arm down, away from any weapon, away from escalation. Chairs scraped loudly as diners pulled back to give space. Someone shouted, though the words were lost in the sudden rush of noise. The waitress froze, eyes wide, tray forgotten. The teenage server stared, transfixed, fear and awe battling in his chest. The officer fought harder now, panic creeping into his movements. He was no longer performing for an audience. He was trying to regain control, to restore a situation that had slipped beyond him. Chuck anticipated each attempt, adjusting his grip, shifting his weight, keeping the officer off balance without unnecessary force. Within moments, the officer was forced down onto one knee, then both, his arm pinned, his posture broken. Chuck stood over him, breathing steady, his face calm. He did not strike. He did not shout. He held the officer there, contained and powerless. The diner was no longer quiet. People spoke at once, voices overlapping in shock and disbelief. Someone near the back fumbled for a phone, hands shaking as they began recording. The manager rushed forward a step, then stopped, uncertain, caught between authority and reality. The waitress set her tray down with a clatter she barely noticed. The teenage server felt something inside him loosen, a tight knot he had not realized was there. He watched the officer, who moments ago had seemed untouchable, kneeling on the floor, restrained, exposed. For the first time since his shift had begun, his fear eased, replaced by a fragile, unfamiliar sense of relief. Chuck held the officer firmly, ensuring he could not rise or reach for anything. He spoke quietly now, not to the officer but to the room, his voice even and controlled. He did not threaten. He did not explain. He simply stated what was happening. The officer would remain where he was until others arrived. Sirens sounded faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Someone must have called already. The knowledge settled over the room like a final seal on the moment. The officer stopped struggling, his breath coming hard and uneven. His face burned with anger and humiliation, but beneath it lay something new and unsettling: uncertainty. The rules he relied on had failed him. The performance had ended, and the audience had not applauded. Chuck did not release his hold. The egg stains on his shirt had begun to dry, stiffening the fabric. They were no longer just a mark of humiliation. They were evidence. As the sirens drew closer, the room remained tense but no longer helpless. The balance had shifted completely. What had been done in public could not be undone, and what followed would not belong to the officer anymore. The humiliation he had staged had turned back on itself, transformed into the very thing he had feared most: exposure. The sound of sirens grew from a distant wail into a presence that could no longer be ignored. It filtered through the diner's walls, weaving itself into the low roar of voices and the scraping of chairs. Chuck Norris remained where he was, his grip firm, his posture balanced, his attention fixed not on the noise outside, but on the man restrained beneath his control. The officer's breathing was uneven now, anger and disbelief breaking through the confidence that had carried him moments earlier. He no longer laughed. He no longer performed. He endured. Chuck adjusted his stance slightly, shifting his weight so the officer's center of gravity stayed compromised. It was a subtle movement, practiced and precise, ensuring that any sudden attempt to rise or reach would fail before it began. He was careful not to cause unnecessary pain, but equally careful not to leave room for resistance. This was not a fight anymore. It was containment. The room around them seemed to expand, as though the walls had been pushed outward by the force of what had just occurred. Diners stood from their booths cautiously, unsure whether to step closer or keep their distance. Some hovered near their tables, hands half raised, as if ready to intervene or retreat depending on what happened next. Others remained seated, staring openly now, no longer pretending to focus on their meals. The silence that had once protected the officer had shattered, replaced by a tense, collective awareness. The teenage server stood near the counter, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding in the aisle. His hands trembled slightly, but he did not look away. The fear that had weighed on him earlier had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being singled out, of being quietly crushed without recourse. It was the fear that comes when something long suppressed finally breaks into the open, bringing consequences that are impossible to predict. Beneath that fear, however, something else stirred: relief, cautious and fragile. The waitress moved at last, stepping carefully around a table to get a clearer view. She set her tray down on the counter, her movements deliberate, her expression composed but tight. She watched Chuck and the officer with the focused attention of someone who understood that this moment would define what came next. She had seen situations escalate before, but never like this. Never with such a clean reversal. The officer shifted under Chuck's hold, testing it with a sudden, desperate surge of strength. Chuck felt it instantly and responded without hesitation, redirecting the effort and forcing the officer back down. The movement was efficient, almost reflexive, and it ended with the officer's arm pinned more securely than before. A sharp exhale escaped the officer's lips, followed by a string of muttered curses that carried no authority. Chuck leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady, meant only for the man beneath him. He did not threaten. He did not insult. He simply made clear, through tone and presence, that further resistance would change nothing. The officer fell silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the entrance as if searching for rescue. The siren stopped abruptly outside. Car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps approached, quick and purposeful. The sound cut through the diner like a blade, sharpening every nerve. Conversations dropped to a hush. Someone near the back whispered a name, then fell quiet again. The door opened and two uniformed officers entered, followed closely by a third. Their presence altered the room instantly. Where the first officer had filled the space with unchecked authority, these newcomers brought something different: structure, procedure, the weight of oversight. Their eyes swept the diner, taking in overturned chairs, the cluster of patrons, the man restrained on the floor. For a fraction of a second, their attention locked on their colleague, and instinct pulled them toward him. Their hands moved toward their belts, their bodies tensing. But they did not act immediately. They looked at Chuck, at the position of his hands, at the controlled way he held the officer down. They looked at the faces of the people around them, at the phones raised and recording, at the expressions that told a story before a word was spoken. One of the officers spoke, his voice firm but measured, asking what had happened. Chuck did not release his hold. He did not answer immediately. He waited, ensuring that the situation remained stable, that no sudden movement would reignite chaos. When he did speak, his words were calm, concise, stripped of emotion. He explained that the officer had assaulted him and that he was holding him until help arrived. The restrained officer protested loudly, his voice cracking with indignation as he tried to reassert his version of events. He accused Chuck of attacking him without cause, of resisting authority, of creating a disturbance. His words spilled out in a rush, desperate to regain narrative control before it slipped away completely. The officers listened, their expressions unreadable. One of them glanced toward the diners and raised a hand slightly, signaling for quiet. He asked if anyone had seen what happened. For a moment, no one moved. The old habit of silence threatened to reassert itself, the instinct to avoid involvement pulling at the edges of the room. Then the teenage server took a step forward. His movement was small, but it carried weight. He stood near the counter, his shoulders squared as much as he could manage, his voice trembling as he began to speak. He described the pressure, the quiet humiliation, the way the officer had singled him out again and again. He spoke of the egg, of the laughter, of the moment when something inside the room had finally broken. As he spoke, his confidence grew. Words came more easily, fueled by the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The waitress joined him, stepping forward to confirm his account. She spoke calmly, her tone steady, adding details the boy had missed, grounding his story in observation rather than emotion. Other diners followed. A man near the window described what he had seen. A woman from the counter confirmed the sequence of events. Phones were raised higher now, screens glowing with recorded proof. The story formed not from a single voice, but from many, overlapping and consistent. The officers exchanged glances. The initial instinct to defend their colleague gave way to a more complicated reality. The evidence was too visible, too immediate to dismiss. One of them knelt beside Chuck and spoke quietly, asking him to release the officer so they could take over. Chuck considered the request, then slowly eased his grip, keeping his hands ready as the officers moved in. They secured their colleague with practiced efficiency, guiding him to his feet and then back down again, this time under official restraint. The officers' protests continued, but they sounded hollow now, stripped of the confidence that had once carried them. As the officers led him away, the room seemed to exhale. The tension that had gripped the diner loosened, replaced by a strange, fragile calm. People spoke softly to one another, voices low but animated. The manager emerged fully from behind the counter at last, his face pale, his eyes darting between Chuck and the officers, as if seeing both for the first time. Chuck stepped back, creating space. He wiped his hands on a clean napkin, then looked down at his stained shirt. The egg marks had dried, leaving stiff patches of yellow against the fabric. He felt them not as shame, but as a reminder of the line that had been crossed and the response it had demanded. One of the officers approached him again, asking for his name, his statement. Chuck answered without hesitation, his voice even. He provided the facts, nothing more, nothing less. He did not embellish. He did not seek sympathy. The truth laid out plainly was sufficient. The teenage server watched from a distance, his chest tight with emotion. He felt something shift inside him as he saw the officer taken away, no longer untouchable, no longer looming over the room. The fear that had defined his shift began to recede, replaced by a cautious sense of possibility. He realized that what had happened would not simply fade away. It would follow all of them, demanding acknowledgement. Outside, the officers guided their colleague toward the patrol cars. The flashing lights painted the diner windows in alternating bands of red and blue, a reminder that authority could be questioned, that it could be corrected. Inside, the diners began to settle back into their seats, though the atmosphere remained charged, conversations buzzing with the energy of what they had witnessed. Chuck stood near his booth, waiting. He felt no rush to leave, no desire to escape the scene. This moment belonged to more than just him. It belonged to the boy who had been pressured, to the waitress who had watched in silence, to the diners who had finally spoken. It belonged to the room itself. As the last of the officers finished taking statements, one of them approached Chuck and nodded, a brief acknowledgement that carried more weight than words. Chuck returned the nod, understanding what it meant. The process would continue beyond this diner, into reports and reviews and consequences that could not be controlled here. The turning point had passed. What remained was aftermath, slow and uncertain, but unavoidable. The system the officer had relied on had been forced into the open, and it would have to respond. Chuck glanced once more toward the teenage server. Their eyes met briefly, and this time the look was different. It was no longer about being seen. It was about recognition. Chuck gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned away. The diner, still bright with daylight, stood altered by what had happened within its walls. The quiet that returned was not the same as before. It carried memory now, and with it, the possibility of change. The patrol cars pulled away one by one, their lights fading into the afternoon traffic until the diner's windows reflected nothing but sky and passing clouds. The sirens were gone, yet their echoes seemed to linger in the room, a phantom sound woven into the memory of what had just occurred. The door closed softly behind the last officer, and for a moment no one moved, as if the building itself were waiting for permission to return to its ordinary rhythm. It did not come easily. Chuck Norris stood near his booth, the stiffness of dried eggs still marking his shirt. He felt no urge to wipe it away immediately. The stains had become part of the scene, a visible reminder that something had happened here that could not be reduced to rumor or misunderstanding. He looked around the diner, taking in the faces that had once avoided his eyes, and now met them openly, cautiously, with something close to respect. The manager stepped forward at last, his movements hesitant, his expression tight with a mixture of relief and unease. He thanked Chuck quietly, the words sounding inadequate even to his own ears. Chuck acknowledged him with a small nod, understanding that gratitude was not the point. What mattered was what would happen next, after the adrenaline faded and the paperwork began. The teenage server stood near the counter, his apron twisted slightly in his hands. He looked older now, not because anything physical had changed, but because something inside him had shifted. The fear that had once shaped his movements was no longer the dominant force. It lingered, yes, but it had been joined by something sturdier, the knowledge that silence was not the only option. He caught Chuck's eye again, and this time he did not look away. There was no need for words. The look they shared carried understanding, an acknowledgement that what had been done mattered, not just for this moment, but for the ones that would follow. The boy straightened his shoulders unconsciously, a small act that felt enormous. The waitress approached, her steps careful, her voice low. She offered Chuck a clean cloth, her expression apologetic despite the fact that she owed him nothing. He accepted it with a quiet thank you and wiped his hands, then his face, though he left the shirt as it was. The cloth came away stained yellow, and she took it back without comment, nodding once before returning to her station. Around them, the diners began to talk again, but the conversations were different now. They were quieter, more deliberate, threaded with reflection. People discussed what they had seen, what they had felt, what they might have done differently if given another chance. Some spoke with relief, others with lingering anger or shame. All of it was part of the reckoning. A man near the window stood and approached the counter, placing money down for his meal. He paused, then added a few extra bills to the stack. "For the kid," he said quietly, nodding toward the teenage server. Others followed, not in a rush, but steadily. The gesture spread without announcement, a collective decision that did not need explanation. The teenage server noticed the growing pile of bills and froze, his face flushing. He shook his head at first, instinctively refusing, but the manager placed a hand on his shoulder and said something quietly that made him stop. The boy swallowed and nodded, his eyes shining. It was not about the money. It was about being seen, about having his experience acknowledged rather than dismissed. Chuck watched this unfold with a calm satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride. He had not come here to teach lessons or to be celebrated. He had simply refused to look away, and in doing so had given others permission to do the same. The consequences were unfolding on their own now, shaped by the people who had lived inside that moment. One of the officers who had taken statements returned briefly, stepping inside to speak with the manager. He confirmed that reports would be filed, that footage from phones in the diner's cameras would be reviewed, that there would be follow-up. His tone was professional, measured, but there was no attempt to soften the implications. The incident would not disappear into a drawer. Too many eyes had been on it. The teenage server listened from a distance, his heart pounding as the reality settled in. The officer who had intimidated him would be investigated, his behavior scrutinized not just by internal processes, but by public awareness. The system that had felt immovable earlier now appeared vulnerable, capable of being questioned. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the officer left again, the diner finally began to breathe. Plates were cleared, coffee was poured. The bell from the kitchen rang, and a cook's voice called out an order with forced brightness that slowly grew more natural. Life resumed, but it did so with an undercurrent of memory that would not fade quickly. Chuck gathered his belongings and reached for his wallet. The manager waved off payment, insisting, but Chuck placed cash on the table anyway, sliding it beneath a napkin. He did not argue. He had learned long ago that insisting on one's own terms mattered, even in small things. He paused by the counter on his way out, glancing once more at the teenage server. The boy met his gaze and nodded, a simple gesture that carried gratitude, respect, and something like resolve. Chuck returned the nod and turned toward the door. As he stepped outside, the afternoon light felt different, sharper, more honest. The air carried the ordinary smells of asphalt and passing cars, but beneath them lingered the faint trace of something else, the after-image of confrontation, of truth spoken aloud. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into memory. Behind him, the diner continued on, altered but intact. The teenage server returned to his work with steadier hands. The waitress moved between tables with renewed purpose. The manager stood a little straighter behind the counter, aware now that avoidance had a cost. The patrons ate and talked and carried the story with them as they left, sharing it later with friends, family, anyone who would listen. The officer, miles away by now, faced a different reality. Reports would be written, statements would be compared, footage would be reviewed. The quiet patterns of behavior he had relied on would be exposed under scrutiny, stripped of the protection silence once offered. Whether the consequences were swift or slow, they were unavoidable. The system he had manipulated would now have to confront itself. Chuck started his engine and pulled back onto the road, merging with traffic as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. He did not look back. He did not need to. The measure of what had happened was not in his departure, but in what remained behind. In the end, the diner was just a diner again. Red booths, wide windows, the steady rhythm of everyday life. Yet beneath that familiar surface, something had changed. A line had been drawn and crossed and answered. Fear had been named, challenged, and diminished. Silence had been broken, not by shouting, but by the simple refusal to accept humiliation as normal. Chuck drove on, another stretch of highway opening ahead of him, carrying with him no sense of victory, only certainty. The world did not change all at once, and justice did not arrive in neat conclusions. But sometimes in ordinary places, a moment arrived that demanded a response, and sometimes someone answered. If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe for more real, intense stories like this. Watch the next video on the channel, share this one with others, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think should have happened.